Today's World-Beater Wrestling episode is all about helping you if you're really struggling to understand and retain the new skills you're learning. This is a really interesting question because you'll often hear that you either have it or you don't, which kind of sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer. It takes a lot of responsibility off the trainers and teachers. And then on the other side, you'll sometimes hear that there's no bad students, only bad teachers. And while yes, sometimes there can be bad students who just cannot or will not learn, but there can also be terrible teachers who, despite the skills that they can show themselves, really struggle to teach those skills to others. So I feel like the answer lies somewhere in the middle, but there are definitely 5 roadblocks that I've found with trainees of mine and even myself in my journey that can prevent you from fully understanding new skills and retaining them for later on. The first potential roadblock that you need to think about is how often you are training. And I had a whole episode on this recently where I recommended that 3 to 4 days is probably the optimal range where you're not going to burn yourself out and under-recover, but you're going to pick up as much as you can and practice it as much as you can. Now for me, reps are the key. Physical reps. If it's a new skill, a new movement, doing that new movement over and over and over. It's one thing to see it and to learn it and be taught it. It's another thing to ingrain it in your short and then long-term memory. So if you can get in once a week, yeah, you'll learn things, but you'll probably lose it because the next week the class has moved on. You're learning new things, particularly if you don't put them into practice. The second potential roadblock that kind of follows on from this is all about reps and the quality of reps. Are you training on days that have a huge amount of trainees and you're just not getting a lot of ring time? Or are you training on days where there are very few trainees? You're getting way more ring time, way more reps, or even private sessions where you're going to get a whole heap more reps. It all makes a difference. On top of that, you learn a new skill, but when do you do it again? Are you doing it as part of your matches later on in the training session? Are you using it in your skills and drills? I know personally speaking, I always make it a challenge for my trainees, if we're learning a certain theme or a certain skill, that they then have to apply that later on when we have match practice. The third point, and this is often the most common roadblock I see, is your mindset and focus. What are you thinking about during training? When you're watching other wrestlers in the ring going through the same skills and drills that you're about to do, what are you thinking about? Are you getting feedback from what they're doing right or wrong? Are you looking for certain things that you struggled with and seeing how other people do it better? Or are you in your own head and stressing and anxious and overthinking everything? On the same note, what are you doing when the coach gives you feedback? Are you actually listening? Are you actually trying to understand it, and are you asking questions if you don't? Because often I find the case is that just doesn't happen. And I can see the cogs turning. I can see that trainee not listening to a word I'm saying. It's all going over their heads because they're so freaked out about the fact that they couldn't do a certain technique or they don't quite understand it. So make sure to just relax, calm down. Don't take it as a personal knock if you get feedback. Don't let it affect your ego. Just try to learn as best you can. And if you're struggling in the moment, ask your coach after training if they can show you again how to do it, just to clarify. Really, when it comes down to it, pro wrestling development is about being coachable. Are you coachable? Can you learn from feedback? If you can, you're going to progress a lot quicker than others. Also, do you have a journal for pro wrestling? I always like to write in a journal, write down the different steps to skills, write down creative things that came to mind. You know, some people are visual learners, some people are written learners, some people are verbal learners. There's all different types of learning. And for me, I always wanted to tick off every box. So I'd write things down. I would try to film things. If your coach or your trainer lets you, see if you can film parts of training just for your own personal use. I know that sometimes it's allowed, and that may help you revise things later on. And if you can't, I have a whole YouTube channel of stuff you can watch. But honestly, that's why I made this channel. It's so that I can break down technique for you. You can watch it over and over, try to understand it, and obviously ask questions if you're not quite getting it. I remember when I was a young fan of pro wrestling and just starting my training. This is back when we had VHS tapes, and there was always a button on the remote that was slow motion, and it would put it frame by frame, and I would rewind and I would frame by frame watch all of the little movements. And honestly, that's how I taught myself. That worked best for me. I think it's also important to train with a whole range of coaches. Learn from different people, because as coaches, we all come from different experiences and walks of life. On top of that, you might resonate with a certain coach over another. That's not necessarily a knock on one coach or the other, but sometimes you just connect better. Their lessons and their delivery work best for you. And if you have an opportunity to travel and learn elsewhere, then do so, because sometimes you'll find the biggest learning experiences come with that culture shock of learning at a completely different school. And if you're at training or a show and there's more experienced people there, don't be afraid to pick their brains. No one's going to hold your hand on this journey. You are really the captain of your own ship. So take initiative and take your own steps to growth. And the last thing I want you to think about is whether you're thinking too much about the steps over the principles. What I mean by that is the steps being step 1, 2, 3, 4 of a technique or skill. Not the worst thing in the world to look at and understand. You absolutely have to learn these things. But if you think about the why and how, the principles behind the action, behind the movement, you can fill in those gaps if you start to forget pieces of the puzzle. You can teach yourself things later. You learn those fundamentals, and now when it comes to the more difficult advanced skills, you can kind of teach yourself based on these principles. A really good example of this is the episode I had on chain wrestling principles recently. We looked at 3 things you need to know to break any chain wrestling hold. We look at the grip, we look at moving into space, we look at breaking their base. And just by learning those 3 principles, we know that if we're ever stuck in a hold and we don't know how to get out because we haven't learned steps 1, 2, 3, 4, we can kind of figure a way out based on the principles alone. So always try to make those connections. And if you're a coach or a trainer, the same goes for your teaching. Always teach the why. Always teach the principles behind the action. And I'm going to have a whole episode in the future all about principles over steps. I think it's probably one of the most important lessons I could ever teach, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. And I'll wrap this up by saying never be disheartened or kick yourself if you're not quite getting things straight away. You're always going to have strengths, you're always going to have weaknesses, and they're always going to be different to the people around you. Never compare yourself with others. Only look at your own journey and look at the progress you've made from point A to point B to point C. I can tell you that if you had the exact same experiences as me from the start of my career to the present day, not one of you would be in the same position that I'm currently in. Some of you might be better, some of you worse. Some of you might have made it all the way to the top and be making a lot of money, and some of you might have quit wrestling 10 years ago. We are all unique and beautiful snowflakes, so please don't be so hard on yourself. Only compare yourself to yourself. And if you've had any other roadblocks that you've experienced in your career that have prevented your progress, maybe something you want a bit of feedback or advice on, please don't hesitate to drop it in the comments below. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, ring the notification bell so you can stay up to date with future World-Beater Wrestling episodes dropping every Thursday.
If you want to see more videos like this, click on the subscribe button, spread the word, and if you have any questions or requests for World-Beater Wrestling, don't be afraid to comment below.